the dark photons. The relevant point is that these dark photons are not just vacuum, they're part of the quantum state of the laser light. By the way, this video comes with a quiz that lets you check how much you remember. That said, while their treatment is genuinely a new way of looking at the double-slit experiment and the maths looks fine to me, I don't think the interpretation makes sense. For one thing, both the light and dark states of photons still go through both slits. So I think it's misleading that the authors say it's all about particles. The other thing is that, like in the normal treatment of the double-slit experiment, the energy of the light that goes to the dark regions is zero. Again, that supports the interpretation that those dark states aren't anything like particles. However, that doesn't mean the idea is useless, because that treatment with the light and dark photon states, odd as that sounds, is mathematically more general than the usual treatment in which one relies on this wave interference. There are cases where the usual interference approach wouldn't work, but their approach would, and the authors propose several experiments to study this. They also say that understanding the distinction of light and dark states can improve the storage and transmission of information, because you don't want to dump information into the dark states where you can't receive it. Honestly, when I read the headline, I thought this is bullshit. But having read the paper, I think it's a matter of framing. This is a genuinely interesting new way to think about an old experiment. But I don't think that talking about dark states of light is going to make quantum physics any less confusing. So they told you that no one understands quantum.
Hello everyone, so I have an update here on the GRAU 51st Arsenal near Moscow. I thought we were done with that, but we have some excellent new satellite images shared by the British Ministry of Defence on Twitter. First, their statement is on screen now, and it does clarify a few points. I won't read it in full as it's quite lengthy, but firstly, it clarifies what was in it. So it says the Arsenal held 105,000 tonnes of munitions, including ballistic, air-launched and air defence missiles, as well as artillery shells and small arms ammunition. The statement also clarifies that this wasn't a Ukrainian strike but was indeed a fire that caused a munition detonation. Now, Russia said that immediately, but nobody believed them. A bit of a case of the Russian who cried debris here. As Russia's lied so many times in the past, we just don't believe them for one time it actually was an accident. I thought this was a Ukrainian strike and Russia was just lying about it. The Ministry of Defence concluded it was poor weapons handling procedures alongside negligent storage of munitions, and the Ministry of Defence throw in some shade here. This is in keeping with a long-standing trend of regularly evidenced Russian ineptitude with regards to the safe and proper handling of its own munitions. So the British MOD pulling no punches here and criticising Russia for assigning the numbnuts in charge of handling its missiles. Finally, it concludes that this is the largest loss of Russian munitions caused by Russia's own actions in the current conflict so far. Now, onto the satellite imagery. First, this is what I concluded as destroyed with the last satellite imagery we saw a few weeks ago, which wasn't as high quality as this one, which is why I want to take a look at this to see if it confirms anything else. That one concluded multiple ammunition storage bunkers and warehouses were destroyed, the train yard destroyed, a diesel power plant destroyed, and more. So the imagery today confirms what we knew, but it also shows it in higher detail and confirms a few extra. So it's definitely worth a quick look. Here's a nice overview of the destruction. The British MD uploaded it upside down, maybe channeling their inner Australian here. So here, the top is south, the bottom is north. So bear that in mind. The MOD zoomed in on some areas too, which I want to take a look at. First, we're going to have a look at the zoomed in, high detailed section here. This is the epicenter of a blast. You can see an absolutely massive crater, which was once a bunker. Let's zoom in. So, the structures around the epicenter are completely leveled. We had that confirmed with the past satellite imagery, but this shows them a bit clearer. The three in blue were not bunkers, but were above ground warehouses and storage. All that remains of them are the earthen mounds that were supposed to protect them from incidents like this. They obviously went to the same school of protection as the S300 and S400 did, because they failed to protect the warehouses. In red, a hardened storage bunker. It mainly survived, but you can see a gaping hole in the centre and smaller holes in the roof, plus debris outside. So it appears that whatever was inside this detonated and blew the doors open. Or I guess maybe the doors were already open. Either way, it appears that whatever was inside has gone for a Burton. Section 2 in the centre is, or rather was, a long metal storage warehouse. This has a railway track running alongside it. You can see this structure is completely levelled. I didn't highlight it as it would make the map too cluttered. You can see a crater slap bang in the middle of it. Now, I don't know whether this crater is something that was stored here that detonated, or if a missile from the other ammo bunker that detonated landed here and levelled this. But regardless, this storage facility is gone. Now, on the Google Maps imagery, this storage facility is open to the elements at the upper end, so it seems like a temporary storage area considering the train track. So, from what I can tell here, this seems to be where munitions arriving here are unloaded from the trains and then taken to the hardened bunkers, or munitions taken from the hardened bunkers taken to here and then loaded onto the trains. This definitely appears to be the main loading and reloading section, which is a Brucey bonus because originally I just thought this was storage for non-munitions, tools, light vehicles like forklift trucks, storage crates and the like, things like that we'd expect to see at a facility like this. But it seems more like it's reloading and loading the munitions, so hopefully something very important was here, about to arrive at the front lines, and is now gone. Highlighted in red are three hardened underground bunkers. I'm going to go left to right. On the left you can see what is now covered with more holes from a Moskva. You can even see smoke coming out still. So whatever is inside here is destroyed. This was a hardened munition bunker, so it must have been something important. But the fact it isn't completely levelled, I'm guessing something less explosive than where the epicenter were. Those epicenter ones were just a crater, I imagine is where the missiles were. Moving right, our second red highlighted bunker, again destroyed. You can see smoke coming out of this one too, and its doors look to have been blasted open with debris scattered around outside. And at the bottom, our third hardened bunker. This one, it looks like the roof has collapsed completely because of a blast. In blue, are three more above ground warehouses, all completely levelled with nothing remaining. The next section we'll zoom in on is this. This is the base's rail yard, a large structure with railway tracks on either side and various buildings. You can see the roof of this building is destroyed for the most part with just the skeleton remaining. Here, you can see just to the right what looks to be a variety of utility trucks, but they're not. We'll get to that in just a moment. I've added two blue arrows. One shows what appears to be a crater where something pretty heavy landed, but again it isn't, as we shall soon see. The other shows a train parked up. I didn't see this in other satellite imagery because the images weren't clear enough, so this is something new we can see here. And I can't tell if this is newly arrived after the strike or was here during. There is some shading and shadows on the train which looks like it could be fire damage, but I can't tell for certain. Here it is on Google Maps. You can see the objects which appear to be trucks are here as well, in the exact same positions. So, they aren't trucks, they must be some kind of storage containers just littered around. You can also see that the train is in the siding, two carriages, the same as in the aftermath. So, I think this train doesn't move anymore, or very rarely. You know our railways and goods yards and the like, you can sometimes see trucks and carriages and the like just left in a siding that haven't moved for years and have been abandoned. I think that's the case here, but the infrastructure of the rail yard is certainly finished here. Technically still standing but full of holes and signs of fire damage. The UK government provided a final, zoomed in high quality section which I'll take a look at now. This one is paired with an after showing this area completely destroyed as well. This is located next to the area which I think was the epicenter of the blast. You can see these bunkers detonated pretty well as well. This one shows three hardened structures and two of the above ground warehouses. In green, a very small hardened shelter, which I believe is something to do with the filtration, power, or temperature control for the bunkers and that sort of thing. When I first looked at this place in the original videos, I thought these were some sort of air raid shelters, but there are quite a lot of them. Typically, one of the hardened shelters seems to have one of these near it, so I think it's some sort of control of the environment of the stuff inside. I put that in green. This one here is destroyed with a big hole in it. Now, the bunkers. The one on the left is intact. ish. There are craters surrounding it, but if you look carefully at the roof, you can see it is sagging and has caved in somewhat. And on the right hand side, there's a big hole and a crack running through it. The one in the centre has been replaced by a crater. The one on the right, you can see more clearly here. The roof of the shelter has caved in. It seems these hardened shelters are made just as shabbily as everything else that Russia has, as I don't imagine the roof is intended to prolapse like this. In blue, two above ground warehouses both levelled. Now, that's if the zoomed in section that the British MOD supplied. The main image, when I zoom in on different sections, the image quality gets worse, but it is clear enough to show us some new stuff and confirm some additional things. This section here, we previously had marked as one bunker shown as unknown, one warehouse shown as unknown, and the rest originally seemed to be fine and dandy. That isn't the case. If we zoom in on that section with this new clearer satellite imagery, we can add two more bunkers to our tally. The top one, which I had marked as safe, you can see smoke coming from inside the bunker. It is hard to make out, there isn't much of it, and I hope it comes across clear on YouTube. It isn't a huge amount of smoke, but smoke coming from inside nonetheless. So, I don't think we could call it destroyed, but the fact there's a fire inside means whatever is stored there can't be in the best of shape. The second one, just below it, this was originally marked as unknown, but we can now confirm this is destroyed. You can see smoke coming through it much more clearly here, from the bottom right hand corner, and looking like it's coming from the door as well. Next up, this side, the same area. This warehouse was marked as unknown, but you can see a big hole in the bottom part where something landed on it. So we can definitely mark this one as damaged now. I've added them now on our map as blue to indicate damage, and the yellow bunker turned red for destroyed. So, not too bad. One more bunker confirmed destroyed, another hardened shelter confirmed as damaged is a nice bonus. There was another building marked as unknown in the blue circle. I'm going to check it out now, since we have better imagery, and it's shown here. Hard to see because it's in shadows, but it looks still standing and not damaged. Nothing new to add here, just one to subtract. It's above ground warehouse. So I'll mark it as green for safe. Now, we're also going to check the big building in the blue circle. This was originally thought of as being safe in the imagery we had before, but we now know that isn't the case. So, you can see this is indeed damaged. Still standing technically, but I wouldn't want to go up onto the top floor and do a tap dance. There's multiple holes blasted into it, bits and pieces of it littering the ground. It looks like it will fall over if somebody sneezed on it. I will label it as damaged, but really it's quite badly damaged. I mean, I guess I might as well put this as destroyed given the amount of wreckage littering it, and some of the roofs have collapsed. This will have to be condemned, and if Russia intends to rebuild this place, then this building will have to be torn down. To the left, a white roof building with holes. Originally thought to be safe, but is damaged. Minor damage, but still. The others we can see here, we've already had confirmation of. This bit here, the building was marked as yellow for unknown. You can see now that it's safe. The others around here, we had confirmed already. There is debris littering around, but none of the bunkers are destroyed. So, our map now amended. One new bunker confirmed destroyed, one new bunker confirmed as damaged and smoking, one warehouse confirmed now as damaged at the bottom, and the large hub of the base confirmed as very badly damaged, and the warehouse next to it slightly damaged. Removed from our map, one warehouse now confirmed as safe, and one bunker confirmed as safe. So that's it for this video. Hope you found it interesting. A bit of a longer one, but I definitely thought these were worth.
Hey there, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. Happy Vyshyvanka Day. Wear your Vyshyvanka and be proud of it that you support Ukraine. But our main event today is obviously around the peace talks in Turkey, or lack of peace talks, or what's happening there. So let's dive in and I will tell you everything that you need to know and be updated on that situation. Firstly, very brief recap on how we got to this event where Russia and Ukraine are going to be talking to each other directly. Russia is attacking Ukraine in their aggressive war of conquest. We had some indirect negotiations between Russia and Ukraine at the start of the war before it was clear that Russia just wants capitulation of Ukraine and they are actually committing non-stop war crimes. Once it was clear that Russia is committing war crimes in Bucha and other cities, as well as the fact that their demands on the table that were put before Ukrainian delegation was basically nothing more than just capitulate and be ready for our future invasion, then the whole talks collapse despite whatever else you might hear in media. We talked about it extensively in my previous video. Then skip 3 years in a bloody war in which Russia failed to achieve even the most minimal of their goals of capturing Donbass. They failed to capture the whole of the regions. They're yet still to challenge any kind of major settlements in those regions, and overall their progress has been absolutely minimal, while there's been sustaining massive casualties over the period of time, reaching right now close to 1 million men. Moreover, Soviet stockpiles of the equipment are unfortunately running somewhat dry for Russia, and their economy is struggling pretty extensively, both due to internal problems, the cost of war, and the fall in oil prices. Obviously, Ukrainians do not have it easy, because while we're looking and seeing that Russians are not advancing on the map, this is not the situation on the paper. On the paper, Russia and Ukraine are not peer armies. Russian military is much bigger than Ukrainian is, and they have much more resources. So they should have steamrolled Ukraine if you would just look at the paper. But because Ukrainians are so much more capable fighters, this is not happening. However, they're obviously sustaining certain losses, and they're obviously having the pain of the extended long-term conflict. Then comes in Trump's administration that deviates from reasonable US policies of supporting democracies and democratic countries, and instead tries to pretend that there's some kind of neutral party and they want to cozy up to Putin to try to potentially, as they call it, resolve this war and get some peace done. Where in reality they started using the stick and carrot approach, where Ukraine got all of the sticks and Russia got all of the carrots, where Trump's administration proposed Putin everything to recognizing some of the territories that Russia has occupied, and cutting off some of the aid from Ukraine to pressure Ukraine to do something that they would never want. And this is how we get to the current situation, where Ukraine initially didn't want to participate in any kind of negotiations with Russia. However, Trump's administration, by applying the stick and trying to pressure Ukraine, has forced Ukraine to agree to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire, to which Ukraine said, we are ready. And after that proceeded Russia basically declining every single time for different reasons to participate in the 30-day unconditional ceasefire. And now we're at another point of that little theater where Putin, because he started trying to propose some kind of 3-day ceasefire and Zelensky cornered him by saying, why not just do 30 days? Putin said, we will not accept 30-day ceasefire, but we will ready to talk with the Ukrainian side directly, to which Zelensky raised the bets and said, I'm going to Turkey, I'm gonna meet you there. So Putin basically is now either chicken out or do nothing. And Putin is once again stating it clearly for everyone that he is not ready for any kind of ceasefire negotiations, because he just announced his team, and this team is basically speaking for themselves. The leader of his team is Vladimir Medinsky, and then there's a bunch of no-names, people that are absolute nobodies. Like, if Ukraine would send the cleaners from their president's administration, I think that would be comparable to the level of people that is sent by Putin. But the leader is Vladimir Medinsky, who is, again, basically a nobody. He's nominally counted as an assistant or advisor to Putin, but it's an absolutely no-name position. And the only question that you should have when you hear about Vladimir Medinsky is, who? What? What is this guy? Because the only thing that he is kind of known for is that at some point he stated, very proudly, he stated that I believe that after all the catastrophes that befell Russia in the 20th century, starting with the First World War and ending with perestroika, the fact that Russia has survived and is developing shows that our people have one extra chromosome, trying to explain that Russians are this over people. Unfortunately for him, a person that has one extra chromosome usually is considered to have a genetic disease or have Down syndrome, with all respect to the people that are struggling with this genetic disease. But it's very appropriate that this is what he thinks of Russians. But other than that, maybe he's known that he's a chairman of the Russian Writers Union. But that's about it. Again, an absolute nobody that represents nothing and stands for nothing. So therefore, we should not expect any kind of progress between these talks that Russia and Ukraine is going to have. But in the meantime, Ukraine was able to score a couple of really important diplomatic victories. Firstly, President Zelensky met with Erdogan, and apparently Erdogan actually asked Ukraine to still meet this delegation from Russians. So Erdogan kind of tried to ask Zelensky for a favor, and again, this improves the position for Zelensky with Erdogan, because Putin, to be honest, by neglecting these talks, he not only spit in the face of the Europeans, the Donald Trump's administration, he also spit in the face of Erdogan, he spit into the face Lula da Silva from Brazil that really tried to propose negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, and also some other leaders that were trying to suggest Russia to have these talks between Zelensky and Putin. But Russia doesn't want that, and they've definitely lost this diplomatic battle. Beyond that, there was a great discussion between the Ukrainian delegation and the delegation from the United States, between the Lindsey Graham, Marco Rubio. Now, I know there's a lot of people that are very looking at this picture and saying, yeah, you should not ever trust the US administration. And I somewhat agree with this. However, it is still great to know that Ukraine is trying to have some friends and trying to work through various channels to try.
And alright, so I'm going to be showing you how to do the box triple jump for HMC 4 stars, the 2 stars, metal cap, and swimming beast in the cavern star. It saves around 5 seconds over the elevator clip strat and a total of 10 because you do it twice in 120. So when you start, you want to just hold directly up, C right once, and do 3 long jumps to the door. You see some people do a bunch of dives, but that's not recommended because it's only 1 frame faster if you do them completely optimally. So sometime before you get to the door, you want to go into Mario Cam C down as he just did there. But you don't want to do it too soon before you get to the door, because if the camera is changing right when you enter a door, it will keep changing after you go through the opening the door animation. So that'll mess up your movement and camera and everything afterwards. So you want to just Mario Cam early, make sure you do that. So after you open the door, you pretty much hold upright until your double jump. And what you do is you just hold A, do a kick, run a little bit, do another kick, and when you do the double jump, hold directly up so that you can make it onto the platform. So pretty much just hold up, then start holding up leftish until you get to this spot around. It's not really that precise. Well, after you do your double jump, I forgot to say this, you need to hit C left twice so that you get the right angle and you can just hold directly right. That's a key part. You have to C left twice, not just once, for it to get in the right spot. But after you get here, you hold directly right so that you do a side flip and a double jump. And the triple jump will be on top of the box. So right after the triple jump, you go neutral so that you don't bonk into this wall and instead you go over. Neutral on the analog stick, that is. If you keep holding forward, you will bonk and you'll just fall back down into this room. So you need to go neutral so that you don't go too far forward and you get the right distance. So after you go over the wall, just double tap R and go into Mario Cam C up. You can stay in C down, but that'll create a lot of lag because you're seeing a lot of this level, which is like a lot of water, and especially that beast just creates a ton of lag there. Of course, it doesn't matter if you're on BC, but if you're on N64, you should try to go into Mario Camp C up here. Anyway, here you want to pretty much go neutral for a little while, because if you are too far forward over the star, you will die in a pit of just whatever. You'll just die. So you want to go neutral, and when you fall, just like a little bit above the star, you want to dive forward. You don't want to dive too early or you'll die. So like around there, you dive. And for the right lag reduction, you go into lag 2 and C left a few times. But if you're not comfortable doing that, you can just stay in Mario Cam C up, because it's better than going Mario Cam C down, and it's pretty easy. So that is the entire star. Alright, so I'm going to be showing you how to do the box triple jump for HMC, 4 stars, the 2 stars, metal cap, and swimming beast in the cavern star. It saves around 5 seconds over the elevator clip strat and a total of 10 because you do it twice in 120. So when you start, you want to just hold directly up, C right once, and do 3 long jumps.
Try to get US support on board for Ukraine as much as possible. And as much as we are skeptical about this, because Trump is trying to essentially give Putin all of the leeway that he can, trying to propose any kind of carrot that they could, like proposing to have another concession to Russia. But Ukrainians are having some success. We see that rhetoric is changing. We see that Ukrainians are playing this weird diplomatic game, and generally there seems to be an agreement that potentially some new sanction packages can come in and put additional pressure on Russia, specifically for the Russian oil tanker fleet, which is, I think, is going to be the most direct impact on the war in Ukraine and in the Russian economy. The war continues, and actually the important things is not what's happening right now at the diplomacy, but more what's happening right now at support for Ukraine, because support for Ukraine is what matters the most. And Norway confirms that they will be sending all of their promised F-16s until the end of the year, which is a great news indeed, especially because other countries are committing to supply Ukraine with more F-16s as well. F-16s are piling up for Ukraine, and the more they will get, the more capabilities they will have. And right now, they're slowly but surely already making an impact. We're seeing that there's always airstrikes that are supporting Ukrainian armed forces whenever they're doing some kind of activities, like recent incursion into the Kursk region once again was supported by Ukrainian aviation, which is great news to hear. France is stating that all of the produced Caesar self-propelled howitzers in 2025 will be delivered to Ukraine. Again, we're seeing commitment not only in words, not only in sanctions, but in continuous support for Ukraine. Once again, great news, and I'm hoping more countries will continue sending weapons to Ukraine that are super needed. Germany is stating that they are actually looking to increase their defense spending by 2032 to 5%, of which 3.5% will be the direct spending into German defense, and 1.5% will be investment into military-related infrastructure. This is absolutely great news. That means that Germany will pretty much double, if not more than double, their defense expenditure, and because they're main economy inside of the European Union, they're also kind of the mood setter for the European Union. So therefore, with Germany increasing their defense spending, we will see additional rise of commitment from the European allies to the defense spending. Obviously, we can argue that 2032 is a bit of a stretch, that we need to be a little bit more speedy, but I guess it's better than nothing. Additionally, it's great to see that Merz does not change his hawkish stance on Russia, and I know a lot of Germans have issues with Merz, but this channel is for Ukraine, so we are primarily looking at everything that is happening in the prism of Ukraine. So Merz is definitely a lot more hawkish on Russia than beforehand, and there might be an additional new push towards confiscating of the Russian frozen assets, but I would not be putting a lot of eggs into this basket. But Germany is definitely struggles, especially because the coalition's second party, the SPD, does not really make it easy. Now, the SPD is a party of Scholz, and we already know that issue with Taurus missiles. And I want to underscore here a very important thing. Taurus missile supply to Ukraine will change nothing. There is no wonder weapon. There is no weapon that can be delivered to Ukraine that will just solve everything. Well, maybe nuclear. And again, it's an argument whether even if Ukraine has nuclear weapons, it will actually help it or not. But more importantly, the Taurus missile and not supplying of Taurus missiles is a direct indicator that we are still drawing red lines for ourselves. And this has been, again, clearly stated by the senior SPD figure right over here. The parliamentary group leader of SPD has been stating that Taurus missile should not be happening to Ukraine because then it will become a party of war, which is an absolute nonsense. It's a complete non sequitur. It's a Russian propaganda statement. And again, SPD has been a little bit in the eyes that one of their members have been going to Baku in Azerbaijan and talking with a representative of the Russian Gazprom, most likely discussing the potential for easing up on sanctions on Gazprom and supplying once again energy to the Europeans. So Germany is still struggling with a lot of the legacy with working with Russians, and there's still plenty of figures that are looking to betray any kind of agreements and any kind of safety of Europe for personal profit. There's still a lot of people like that in Europe, and this is a fight that we all need to remember and fight through. So stay strong and continue focusing on these kind of people within your government. Then at the end, very fast, couple of news. We're going to have a separate video where we're going to cover the new Russian offensive that started right now on the front lines. So you will hear more news of Russia capturing this village, that village, more territory. Secondly, there has been rumors about Russia amassing things on the border with Finland or the Baltics, and some people were claiming, what does this mean? Does it mean that Russia is going to start invading? No, they're not, because what this accumulation or massing of forces on the border means is that there is now a village built 35 miles from the border of Finland that can house up to 2,000 troops, which is like, it's not even drop in a bucket. 2,000 troops is like nothing. It's not a serious force. It's nothing to be wary of. Or the second one, that roughly 100 miles from the border with Finland, they built a new parking lot for the military units that can house about 50 military units of armor. So again, that's not the scale to be worried about. So all of this nonsense that Russia is amassing troops near the border of Finland, I mean, it just shows you if 2,000 troops potentially being housed near the border of Finland is making the news, then it just shows you the scale of how much Russia has actually pulled away from the border with Finland altogether. And finally, tackling the narrative that there is no support for what Zelensky is doing in Ukrainian society, the new polls came out and we see that Zelensky's support is now 74%, that people that support the actions of President Zelensky. Insanely high ratings for support for Zelensky. They're comparable maybe to the ones that were there for Zelensky during the Ukrainian counteroffensive when they were recapturing territory from the Russians. So big support. Zelensky is popular in Ukraine. People of Ukraine are behind him. Ukraine is fighting. Ukraine will continue to fight. Trust in Ukrainian armed forces. Trust in Ukraine. Wear your Vyshyvanka proudly. I love you. Slava Ukraini, and I will see you next time.
By now, most international observers are aware of NATO's policy to not admit countries with ongoing territorial disputes. Critically, that means that, as long as Russia's invasion continues, Ukraine will not become a member of the organization. However, there are practical steps that Ukraine can take now, and is taking now, that will help facilitate the process once that other barrier disappears. Among other things, one trick is resolving something known as interoperability problems, which somehow involves the need to purchase a whole bunch of swivel chairs. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The story actually runs a whole lot deeper, and delves into the core construction principles of alliances. So, to better understand what is happening here, I sat down with Brad Smith, an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University's Department of Political Science, whose primary research focus is alliance politics. And, confession time, we overlapped in grad school and have written a ton of papers together. Anyway, I began by asking Brad about some of the fundamental differences between the alliances of yesteryear, like those from World War I and World War II, and modern-day alliances like NATO. One of the things that struck me in our conversation before recording is the evolution in alliance construction. Why don't you start off by going into detail about what has happened there?
So there have been big changes in what alliances look like. And this difference is especially stark when you compare the average alliance in the 19th century and the average alliance in the 20th century. In the 19th century, the typical alliance was designed to open a second front in an ongoing war, to divert the resources of an enemy away from the battle that they were fighting so that the initial combatant could get an advantage. If you look at an average alliance in the 20th century in contrast, they're much more about active coordination between the allies, and this leads to concerns about what we'd call interoperability, which is the ability for the two militaries to talk to each other and effectively work together in conjunction on the battlefield.
I think many of our listeners will readily grasp that there is a substantive difference between how older alliances function versus newer alliances by thinking about those examples from World War I and World War II versus the Cold War and NATO today. But what exactly caused that shift over time?
That's a great question, and scholars are still working this out, but I'll talk about a couple of forces. In some work with my Vanderbilt colleague Peter Bills, we set out to understand secret alliances. And this led us to think about two forces that have changed that might account for some of these changes in the way alliances look now versus how they did in earlier periods. So one of these changes is a big change in the distribution of interests in the international system. So in the 19th century, the international system was characterized by what scholars call multipolarity, which is the idea that the distribution of military power was relatively even across a large number of states. In contrast, in the post-World War II era, the international system was largely characterized by bipolarity, with most of the military power concentrated in the hands of the United States and the Soviet Union. The second change is the advent of nuclear weapons. The effect of this is pretty simple. It just increased the deterrent value of any alliance that included a member that was nuclear equipped. The consequence of these two changes is that alliances look different now. First, the transition to bipolarity made it much clearer who your friends are and who your enemies are. What this meant is that states were much less worried about having contradictory alliances and were less likely to keep them secret, as they were in the 19th century. The second force, the advent of nuclear weapons, just enhanced the deterrent value of alliances, such that the occurrence of a war was much less likely than it was in previous eras. Together, these two forces meant that alliances could be used for purposes that they previously weren't. NATO provides a very good example of this. Some work by a scholar named Tim Sale makes the argument that one of the primary purposes of NATO was in managing the internal politics of the members and making sure that none of them were taken over by some kind of unpredictable leader that might lead the entire alliance into an unfavorable conflict. Another effect of nuclear weapons and the enhanced deterrent value of alliances is that states had more room to breathe in terms of peacetime preparation for war. When you combine this with technological advancements like radio and satellite communications technology, what this meant is that allies could spend more time and effort planning for how to effectively fight together on the battlefield.
Well, that seems to raise an interesting issue that has direct implications for the future of Ukraine and NATO. You were saying that alliances want to be careful about who is running the member state countries, something that was unimportant during, say, World War II, when the United States just cared that Stalin was fighting off Hitler. Then there is having your alliance militarily function together. How long are these things taking in practice to implement in the modern era?
It can take quite some time, and we can look at the history of Poland and their relationship with NATO to get an idea of how long it takes. 1991 is when Poland first expressed interest in becoming a member of the alliance. In response to this, the NATO members got together and considered what would be necessary for them to be okay with Poland joining the alliance. 6 years later, in 1997, the NATO members concluded that Poland was finally ready, and they extended a formal invitation. But even then, it still took 2 years before Poland became a full NATO member.
I think that might be interesting to people who have only recently started paying attention to NATO politics, starting after the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Because what they're most familiar with, aside from what's going on with Ukraine, which of course is taking a long time, is the NATO entry from Sweden and Finland, both of which happened in relatively rapid succession. So could you describe a little bit about what went on there and why those two countries were so quick to be able to join?
The contrast between Sweden and Finland and Poland, or Ukraine, is really illustrative here. Sweden and Finland are both consolidated democracies, so NATO had no concerns about their internal politics, and they also have advanced modern militaries, so interoperability was much less of a concern. And so in this sense, Sweden and Finland were almost already NATO members, and they're not really representative of many of the aspirational members that we think about, like Ukraine.
Okay, the democratic institutions part seems relatively straightforward, and I could also understand why interoperability problems could arise, but I'm having a hard time conceptualizing exactly what that looks like. Is the problem preparing for a war, or is the problem what would happen if they were actually fighting a war?
It's really both, and those are related concerns. Let me give some examples. After World War II, the United States and the British realized that it would be really advantageous if the NATO members could agree to the same ammunition standards. And as it turns out, establishing the standard was actually pretty difficult for a variety of political and economic reasons, and the standard has also changed over the years.
Yeah, that was actually a big topic of conversation when I was at NATO headquarters a few months ago, that NATO as an organization is actually a political organization, and a lot of what was slowing that down was the politics of figuring out who's going to do what. And actually, one of the benefits of having the organization in a single headquarters was that they were getting everyone into the same room, which actually reduced the transaction costs and the timing that went along with that and made that whole process a lot faster. Which I suppose is saying something, because it took so long despite that. It would have been far worse otherwise without having everyone headquartered in Brussels.
Exactly. And then there's the second consideration, which is the need for the Allies to engage in joint exercises and prepare for war.
Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's going on in the economy in China, because things are continuing to get worse. And this is separate from what's going on with regards to the tariff situation with the USA. I'm sure you'll be aware that since April the 2nd, there have been additional tariffs applied on Chinese imports. And at one point, they'd got up to 145%. Now, obviously, that is completely unrealistic. That's basically a trade embargo. The USA was saying, we don't want any Chinese imports. And the problem that represented for US companies is that a lot of them were importing components and parts and things that were essential to their businesses. So this wasn't just cheap products going onto the shelves for US consumers to buy. This was actually part of the supply chain for US companies. So as a result of that problem, the US and China have now agreed a 90-day pause in that arrangement. But we still have a 30% tariff in place on all Chinese imports into the US and a 10% tariff for US imports into China. So it's still an increase in prices. And the problem that Chinese companies have is that they've been struggling to be able to pass on their price increases to consumers. If we have a look at the producer price index, which is also referred to as the factory gate price, so this is the price of products as they're leaving Chinese factories, you can see that the latest data for April 25 shows that year on year, producer prices are down by 2.7%. And what that means is that if you're a company in China, you're selling your product today for 2.7% less than you were this time last year. Now, that would be fine if all of your input prices were going down. But for Chinese businesses, they've been seeing increases in material costs, fuel costs, and labor costs. So their costs are actually rising, but their sales prices are falling. And if we look at this chart, you can see that the situation is actually getting worse. We've seen an increase in March and April, and 2.7% is the worst fall that's been seen since October 24. And if we widen the scale of this chart to show what's been happening over the past 3 years, you can see that producer prices have actually been in negative territory since October 2022. So that is 30 consecutive months of falling sales prices. Now, that's an absolute nightmare if you're a business, because all that means is that your margins are continuing to go down because you're making less profit every single month. And it's estimated now that over 50% of all businesses in China are making losses. So this is a situation that's very difficult to turn around. And the tariffs are simply not going to help. And we'll come on to talk about that later in the video, because the export markets are obviously now going to be more difficult. Now, before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about NordVPN, who I've partnered with for today's video, and who are offering Joe Blogs viewers an exclusive 4 months extra on a 2-year plan. Unfortunately, cybercrime is becoming a more and more common occurrence. And it's not just you and I that are being targeted. It was recently reported that multinational telecommunications giant BT Group had to shut down some of its servers following a ransomware attack by a gang called Black Basta. So it's never been more important to protect yourself online. And NordVPN offers a feature called Threat Protection that blocks access to websites known to host malware, including ransomware. So NordVPN is fantastic for protecting you every single time you go online, making sure that people can't steal your identity or your passwords or any money from you. But it's also brilliant for opening up a world of entertainment, because it means that you can access TV shows and movies and sports events and other things in areas that you normally wouldn't be able to have access to. All you need to do is change your location and access all of that entertainment and information. And the fantastic news is that NordVPN is offering Joe Blogs viewers an exclusive 4 months extra on a 2-year plan, which you can access by going to nordvpn.com/Joe Blogs, or clicking in the link in the description below. And the great news is that they also offer a 30-day money-back guarantee. In terms of looking at the Purchasing Managers Index, so this is basically a survey that's taken every single month of all of the purchasing managers in China. So these are the guys who are buying in raw materials and other things that are needed in the manufacturing process for companies. So they have a very good feel as to what's going on in the business, because if they're bulking up, if they're buying lots of additional materials, then they know that things are going well. And if they're not, if they're reducing the amount that they're purchasing, then obviously they know that sales aren't going as well as expected. And this is an index. On the right-hand side, you can see the scale of this. And it goes from 49 to 50.4. And the key issue here is the 50 marker. So if you have a score of 50 on this index, it means that you are neither growing nor contracting as a company. So 50 is the status quo. That means you're doing exactly the same as you were this time last month. So if you get a score of less than 50, it means that the purchasing managers are feeling that their businesses are contracting. And you can see that the score for April has come in at 49. And this is actually the lowest score at any point in the past 12 months. So that tells us that the current situation is the worst that's been seen in China for more than 12 months. And you can see that there's a massive swing between March and April. In March, it was actually the highest level at any time in the last 12 months. And the reason for that change is obviously Donald Trump's announcement on the 2nd of April of the reciprocal tariffs, because that was focused predominantly on China. China was the biggest target. It got hit with that 145% tariff. So that's one of the reasons why the purchasing managers are negative about the outlook. But it isn't actually the only reason. Now, if we have a look at what's been happening with exports, you can see that in April, exports increased by 8%, which was actually quite a decent result. If you look at what's been happening over the last 12 months, it was pretty much on average with where things have been going. So you might think, well, if exports are up by 8%, what's the problem? Well, the problem that we have is that that figure for April includes all of the front loading. So basically, as soon as those tariffs were announced on the 2nd of April, they weren't introduced immediately. So there was a pause before them being introduced. And so a lot of businesses in the USA decided that they were going to order huge quantities of deliveries from China to try to beat the tariff. So basically, they were getting in before those tariffs became effective. So we've seen a massive surge in the amount of exports in April. And it's likely that when we get the data for May, we will see a complete crash, because we'll have had 2 or 3 months worth of exports pulled forward into April. And then obviously there won't be many in May. So whilst 8% looks quite promising, you always have to look under the bonnet, look at the details as to why it's come in at 8%. Now, if we have a look at what's going on with imports, that gives us a really good indication as to what's happening over the next 3 to 6 months, because Chinese businesses will be importing lots of raw materials and other things that they need in their processes before they can manufacture their goods and then export them around the world. And what we can see here isn't good news. You can see that in April, year on year, imports were down by 0.2%. And that's the third consecutive month that imports have fallen. And actually, when you look at the last 7 months, there's only been 1 month, December, when there was an increase, and that was only by 0.1%. So we're not seeing any major movements in terms of Chinese businesses bringing lots of raw materials in to bulk up in order to get lots of things out in the future. So this trend here, if you look at the whole 12 months, you can see that there's a general downward trend. This tells us that Chinese businesses are very worried about what's happening and whether or not they're going to be able to achieve growth at all. Now, in terms of the other option, when you're looking at Chinese businesses, the other option that they have in terms of exports is to sell to the Chinese market. So if their export markets are falling, such as the USA, then maybe they can divert their products into China and start benefiting from Chinese demand. But this chart shows what's happening with inflation. And you can see that in April, year on year prices fell by 0.1%. And that's the third consecutive month of falling prices. So we've now got deflation in China. Prices are going down. So that's obviously good news. If you're a consumer, you can pay less when you get to the tills if you're buying something. But it's an absolute nightmare if you're a company, because if your costs are rising, as we discussed before, if your energy costs are rising, your raw material prices are going up, your rent is going up, your labor costs are going up, if all of those things are going up, you need to be able to increase your prices to try to accommodate some of those increases in costs. But what we're seeing here is that prices are actually going down. So it's a double whammy from China's point of view. And that's one of the reasons why the purchasing managers index is down and why producer prices are also falling. So from the Chinese market's point of view, it isn't very attractive for Chinese businesses. And I thought it was worth having a look at what's going on with food inflation, because we always like to look at what's happening with food prices when we're talking about inflation. It tells us what's going on for the poorest members of society, because they're spending a much larger percentage of their budget on food. And you can see that it's a very similar trend to what we just looked at for general inflation. Prices are down in April by 0.2%. So they actually fell at a faster figure than general inflation. And so if you're in the food industry, that obviously represents bad news. And it was interesting when the initial tariffs came out, when Donald Trump applied the higher tariffs against China, one of the things that China did was to restrict the amount of agricultural and food imports coming from the USA. And I'm sure this was one of the reasons, because China was trying to protect its own industry to make sure that the people in the companies in China producing food were able to sell more of their product. Now, in terms of what's going on with the export market to the USA, this table shows the largest importers into the USA in 2024. And you can see that China is number 2 on this list. And in 2024, in total, around $440 billion worth of goods were sent from China to the USA. And the reason I wanted to highlight this was to talk about the impact of the tariffs on the Chinese economy. Now, initially, we saw those tariffs going up to 145%, which actually would have killed all of those exports over the long term. There is no way that US businesses and consumers would have paid 2.5 times the price for all of these goods. So that was basically prohibitively high. Now, as a result of the announcement of this 90-day pause, the tariffs have now been reduced to 30%, which is a combination of 10% for the reciprocal tariffs, as they've been called, and 20% for the fentanyl problem. The USA claims that a lot of fentanyl drug, which is a major problem in the US, is being produced in China. And until China shows that it's eradicating all of those labs, then this 20% is going to stay in place. So in total, the cost of all Chinese imports is going up by 30% for all US businesses and consumers. Now, from China's point of view, that's obviously going to represent bad news because that's going to encourage both consumers and US businesses to change the way they operate. Businesses are now looking at moving production away from China to maybe other economies, maybe Vietnam or India, or moving it to the USA itself. That's really what Donald Trump is trying to achieve. He wants US businesses to start producing things themselves rather than bringing it all in from China. So that represents a serious threat to Chinese businesses, Chinese revenue going forward, because they're going to see, firstly, an increase in their price. So that's likely to result in lower sales. Simple economics tells us when the price of something goes up and demand doesn't move, then generally speaking, we will see a drop in demand. Basically, people will buy less of something that's more expensive. So, from that perspective, it's bad news for Chinese businesses. But also, if companies are now changing the way they operate to move their manufacturing away from China, then long term, that's going to represent another threat to those businesses. So, the overall impact of the tariffs, whilst there's been an element of positive news that it's been reduced from 145% to 30%, it still represents a 30% increase in the sales price of those products in the USA. And it's one of the biggest markets from China's point of view. And the problem that these Chinese companies have is that they're not getting any benefit from that increase in price. It's going to the US government as part of the tariff. So once again here, there is pressure on these Chinese companies, and they may be expected to actually reduce their sales price further to try to offset that 30% tariff. And if that happens, we will see producer prices going down even more rapidly. That's going to have a massively negative impact on those Chinese businesses and their margins. And so, overall, the impact of these tariffs is going to be hugely negative on Chinese businesses and the Chinese economy. And if we have a look at this graphic, it shows that initially the 145% tariff was going to add an additional $636 billion worth of costs, which clearly would have just completely wiped out all of that business. However, the 30% tariff, which has now been agreed, this reduced rate for 90 days, is still going to add $132 billion. So that's going to mean that US consumers and businesses will want to buy less of it because it's just more expensive. So, what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, as we've seen from today's data, things are getting worse for Chinese businesses, which means it's also getting worse for the Chinese economy. We've seen that the Purchasing Managers Index has now fallen for 30 consecutive months, and the fall in April was the worst that's been seen for 6 months. So, things are getting worse from a Chinese company's perspective because their costs are rising. They're seeing increases in raw material prices, rent, and labor costs, but they're not able to pass that on because their sales price is actually going down and it's continuing to go down. So that represents an absolute nightmare if you're a Chinese company. And it's been reported that more than 50% of them are now making losses. So they're actually having to fund all of those price cuts month on month. But it's actually worse than that because the Purchasing Managers Index, which is the outlook from all of the purchasing managers, is now below that magical 50 level. So that tells us that they're not confident about what the future looks like. And one of the reasons why they're not confident is because of the tariffs that have been put in place by the USA, because that's the biggest single export market for Chinese businesses. And although we've got some progress, it's gone down from 145%, which quite frankly would have killed all of the business overnight. It would have just meant that the USA wasn't going to import anything from China. Nobody wants to pay 2.5 times what they were paying a couple of months ago. It's now gone down to 30%, which is a better situation, but it is still 30% worse than it was a few months ago. So, from these companies' perspective, the sales price of all of the things that they're exporting to the USA is now going to be 30% more than it was at the start of the year. And they're not benefiting from that at all. This isn't an increase in price which is going to improve the factory gate prices. That increase in price is purely because of the tariff that's being applied by the USA. The US authorities will keep all of that 30% for themselves. So Chinese businesses don't get any benefit. And there will be some pressure on those Chinese companies to lower their sales price because if they can lower it by 30%, for example, they could offset the full amount of the tariff. and still have the same sales price in the USA. So that might encourage consumers and companies to continue using them. But the problem you would have if you cut your sales price by 30% is that it means you're getting even less money. And after 30 consecutive months of falling sales prices, I don't think Chinese businesses are going to want to do that. And of course, in terms of the long term view here, the reason why Donald Trump has put these tariffs onto Chinese imports is that he doesn't want US businesses continuing to source things from China. He wants them to make it themselves. So he would like to see all of that manufacturing move to the USA. And obviously, if that happened, then the Chinese businesses that are doing it at the moment would lose all of that trade. But there's probably a middle ground somewhere in between where Chinese companies will still provide some materials to the US businesses, but they're going to see a fall in their volume at the same time as they're seeing a fall in their sales price. So this is a double whammy from Chinese companies' perspectives. And we also saw that the Chinese market itself isn't going to bail them out because we've now got deflation. So prices year on year are falling. We've had 3 consecutive months of falling prices. So that means that Chinese companies are going to have to continue cutting their prices in order to get sales because it's a very competitive market in China. And all of this is a complete disaster if you're running a business in China right now because your export markets are going down and your home market is also in decline. So this represents seriously bad news, not just for those companies, but also for the Chinese economy, because obviously Chinese GDP is the collective from all of the different businesses in China. So if they're all struggling, they're going to struggle to achieve that 5% growth target that's been set for 2025. And of course, what we haven't mentioned in today's video is the property sector. And for the last few years, the property sector has been a complete collapse. It's in the toilet. And that isn't getting any better. We don't have the data yet. I'll report a new video once the data on the housing market comes out. But what we've seen over the past 2 months, 6 months, 2 years is that that data has been in decline. So it's unlikely that the property market is going to bail out what's happening in business. But the overall summary of today's video is that the data that's been released for April that we've seen so far shows us that things are getting more difficult for Chinese businesses. We did see a spike in exports. However, that's likely to be because US businesses have been upfront ordering. They've been ordering up, bulking up, taking in more deliveries to try to beat the tariffs. But we are likely to see a crash in exports in May, and that's indicated by what's happening with imports, which have fallen for the past 3 months. So overall, the situation looks bad in China. The outlook looks worse. And so it is going to be very challenging for China to hit its 5% growth target for 2025. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks, really appreciate that generosity. And if you're a member either through Patreon or YouTube membership or Buy Me a Coffee membership,
What a crazy day today, especially if we speak about the meeting of Ukrainian and Russian delegations in Istanbul that didn't happen. That's why, my friends, first of all, I want to concentrate our attention on what is happening on the front lines. And you know, it is kind of big because Russia went with their massive attack on Ukrainian positions using their standard mid-wave tactics. I've told you before that it seems like they learn on their own mistakes, but guys, I was wrong. They still use absolutely massive amount of the vehicles in a single straightforward attacks. My friends, I'm gonna show you more images from the drone camera, just I want to point out here the location of the Russian failed strike. It happened not far away from Novo-Alexandrovka. Russia tries to expand the bridgehead. They want maybe to go to Dachna or proceed towards the border with Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. The border comes over here, very close to the current front line. And yeah, you may see the reaction of Ukrainian defenders. The Russian convoy was spotted well before. Our guys understood the number of the vehicles coming, also infantry forces, mines and FPV drones. All of that helped to stop this Russian massive assault. Well, I counted at least 6 of the vehicles and I haven't spotted that number for already very long time. Well, it's just gorgeous. The full video, guys, are gonna publish on my Telegram channel, so you may check it out with my link below. 5 of the vehicles were kaboomed there, which carried some of the infantry forces, and they're burning at the same time at the same road. It means that the quantity of the Ukrainian drones is just astonishing. For every vehicle, Ukraine used at least 3 of the drones. And that's how Russian army works now. They take the ground, but at the same time they have absolutely tremendous losses. The Russian propaganda and some of the pro-Russian bloggers, they're very cheerful towards Russia, then Russia has advantage over Ukraine, then Russia attacks. But there are also some of the influencers from the Russian side who say that it's complete disaster. Why? Well, basically because Russia wastes their army in getting some of the kilometers of the ground. Kind of the interesting thing also happened in Torske village. This is very close to Luhansk Oblast, and Russia tried to attack this village like this through the road using the time of the Putin's proclaimed fake ceasefire. Yeah, on 9th of May, definitely Russians went to Torske, they put their flag over there, and this information was spread around the Russian propaganda channel saying that Russia took control over the settlement. But here in Deep State Military Map source, you see that it's still under Ukrainian control. So what happened out there? Well, we have the response. First of all, here's the Russian video. They show definitely some of the Russian soldiers with the Russian flag near one of the destroyed buildings. They've took some photos there also with Russian flags. So definitely it was the successful Russian attack for some time. Because few hours later, Ukraine managed to encircle the Russian group in Torske, imprisoning many of the Russian soldiers. And here we have the confirmation from the Ukrainian drone camera that Russians surrendered to Ukrainian side. So totally absolute useless operation with installing this Russian flag on ruined buildings of Torske went completely wrong for the Russian side. I may tell you that the main idea of those flag operations, of the photos, drone images here as published, the goal of everything of that is for the local Russian commanders to show to the higher command that they advance on the front lines, that they've occupied some of the villages like Torske. For sure, this image went to maybe Gerasimov's office, and Gerasimov in his report will tell and show everything to Putin, like, look how many villages we liberated, they say. And Putin would think, okay, Russian army is winning, because Putin, he also lives in his informational bubble. He doesn't have a personal access to internet to check Telegram, Rumble, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. He gets all of the fake stuff coming to him from the Russian military command and from those kind of the videos which are showing just the temporary Russian success. And you know, here I tell about Putin, but we shouldn't be surprised about the Russian mindset in general, because many Russians, they do have the access to internet. It is not blocked. I mean, YouTube is not blocked after all in Russia. And Russians might check the channels which show the disaster really for the Russian army in Ukraine, of how Ukrainian drones just demolished the Russian convoy, how Russians themselves are kabooming if they hit the mine or FPV drones hit them, but still they want to be ruble millionaires. They think that they're some sort of the Highlanders, immortals, and they continue signing contracts with the Russian army, which is crazy as for me. Oh my god, what a video. I already shared it on my Telegram. So here's the Russian motorcyclist. Let me